Good evening. It's fantastic to see so many people here this evening. Um, I am really pleased to welcome this evening Bert and James to talk about their amazing trip to Senya. And before they talk, I'm going to ask Richard Breman, who's the chairman of the OMT Society, to say a few words about the Richard Greene Award. And then we'll go on to James and Bert's talk. There'll be the opportunity to have ask questions. If you would like to do so, please address them to Merchant Taylors School in the chat. And then at the end of James and Bert's talk, we'll be handing over to Sachin Agarwal, who's one of our upper sixth boys, who's going to moderate those questions. And yeah, really looking forward to hearing all about their trip to Senya. So I'm going to hand over to Richard now.
Thank you, Emma, and good evening. As Emma said, I'm chairman of the Old Merchant Taylors Society, and I'm also very pleased to say that our president, Duncan Edwards, is online from New York, where he lives. We're, as a society, very proud to have instigated in 2020 for a minimum 10-year period, an annual award to senior merchant tailors boys who wish to undertake a project or a trip in pursuit of their better understanding of the wilderness and environment. Richard Greene, whom you can see there with his wife Carolyn on the screen, Richard was a boy born in Maidenhead and a pupil at the school between 1954 and 58, leaving to read applied physics at Brunel. Although a decent science pupil, Richard was at his happiest exploring at Sandy Lodge and far beyond with the Field Club. He ran a successful international conferencing business and was fortunate to be able to float the company on the stock exchange in 1987 and use the proceeds to move to Australia to do what he really wanted to do, to combine his love of helicopter flying with his passion for wilderness photography. Richard became the most acclaimed wilderness photographer in Australia and beyond. Over more than 20 years, he and his wife Carolyn covered over 1 million miles in their, as they referred to it, flying camper van to share the glory of nature through their photography. In 2008, the National Library of Australia in Canberra held an exhibition of his photography. And in 2010, Richard and Carolyn published a beautifully illustrated book called Remote and Wild. Tragically, Richard and Carolyn and their filmmaking friend John Davis were killed when, on the 7th of November 2015, their helicopter crashed in the dense bush of the Wattagans National Park in New South Wales, returning from a protest about the influence of coal mining was having on the beautiful Hunter Valley of New South Wales. I was privileged and delighted to meet Richard in Sydney in 2014 and to chat at length with him about his life and his passion for the environment and wilderness. He was green by name and green by nature, dedicated to making the world a better place. The Old Merchant Taylors Society is delighted to have initiated this award, and it is wonderful that two such intrepid and adventurous merchant tailors as James Tillotson and Bert Edwards could be the prize's first recipients. They will tell you about their experiences north of the Arctic Circle. Over to you both, James and Bert.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming. Great to see you all here. Lots of familiar faces, which is really nice to see. Thank you, Richard, for that introduction, and thank you, Emma, as well. Tonight, Bert and I hope to be able to give you just a really nice overview of our time in the Arctic Circle in Senya, but also the process leading up to that, applying for the prize at school, the entire planning process, travel up into the Arctic Circle, which proved more of a challenge than we could ever have anticipated at first. And then after that, I'm sure there'll be plenty of chance for any questions to be asked, which we're really happy to answer. So it all started at the beginning of upper sixth for Bert and I, when the geography department at the time advertised this new OMT Society award that was available to senior students, the Greene Memorial Prize. And Bert and I saw this, and we both sort of enjoyed expedition outdoor pursuits. We'd done CCF and DOV and a variety of other pursuits in our own time. So we knew this was something of interest, and we decided, yeah, let's go for that. Let's apply for this award. So we went through a process that took a couple of months, pitching sort of initial ideas that we had, countries we wanted to visit, viability of expeditions that we wanted to do. And with Mr. Everson and then the OMT Society, we were fortunate enough to be able to win the award. So at that stage, we were really spurred on, and we were able to turn this dream of an expedition into a reality. So this started off by finding where on earth are we going to do an expedition that allow us to get to some true wilderness, because a lot of places that we've been looking at in Norway had sort of lots of trails, quite built up areas at some points, and that really wasn't what we were looking for. We were looking to find some true wilderness, which is remarkably difficult nowadays. So Bert's going to outline a bit more about that process of how we came upon this island of Senya deep within the Arctic Circle.
Yes, hello everybody, and for those of you familiar with expedition planning, perhaps pupils who've been on Duke of Edinburgh expeditions, the first thing you have to do is route planning. And for us, with so much that we could do, this was actually more of a challenge than in kind of reining ourselves back and not stretching ourselves too far. So initially we were very optimistic, quite over optimistic, and looking to perhaps bite off more than we could chew. I suggested a week of hiking through both Norway and Sweden. We scaled this back to then just in Norway, looking at spots in both the north and the south. But again, that was almost too much. So we then settled on the final destination of Senya, a beautiful island within the Arctic Circle in the north of Norway. The plan was initially to cross all of Senya, taking a combination of paths from the south of the island to the north. However, a somewhat unexpected challenge came up, being the bus timetable. So, as you can see from this image, information is pretty thin on the ground, but with the help of Google Translate, we sometime later were able to work out more or less what the information it was trying to get across to us was. But the key problem was buses just don't run on a Thursday, which wasn't something we particularly expected. So with flights already booked in, and buses not running on a Thursday, we literally just couldn't get to where we had expected to. So yet another iteration of route was in order. But in the end, this really wasn't all bad, as anymore we couldn't, a longer expedition, we really couldn't have carried much more.
Yeah, so with planning the expedition, we actually came across seemingly more challenges. There was only one map in existence of this area of Norway, this island of Senja. So we ordered it on back order from Norway. It took several weeks to arrive, and we finally got our hands on it. And it's a 1 to 50,000 scale map, which those of you familiar with Ordnance Survey maps in the UK might know that they're 1 to 25,000, which is a bit of a larger scale, so you can see more details on the map more clearly. The 1 to 50,000 was pretty suitable for us. However, it meant that we may have missed a few details, which may have come back to bite us later on. But with this and a bit of satellite imagery, we were able to plan our initial route across the sort of the north of Senya, which you can see here. And if you sort of look at that loosely, you'll actually notice that later on, we actually had to make a lot of changes on the ground as conditions were sort of varying fairly substantially in contrast to what we were expecting. But we faced those head on. And another challenge that we faced while doing the expedition and sort of getting there was actually the sheer amount of kits that we had to carry. Because of the geography of Senya, it is right on the coast up in the Arctic Circle. If you look out to sea from the north, the only thing you'd come across if you set out in a boat maybe would be Svalbard, but you'd be straight up into the Arctic. So there's really changeable weather conditions. Things like big sea fogs, which you might have seen potentially almost coming in and during our film, but winds, rains, very cold temperatures like that. So we had to prepare, we had to carry lots of layers, storm shelters, first aid equipment, things like that. Thankfully, most of that we didn't need to use because while we were on the island, we had an almost suspiciously good spell of weather, which had its own challenges, but that meant we were carrying a lot of potentially excess kits, as well as a lot of food and a lot of water, which Bert can provide more detail on.
Yeah, so a little bit on food planning, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, is quite an important part to any expedition. And if you carry too much food, you're essentially carrying dead weight for the duration of the expedition, which is going to tire you out much faster and you're not going to have a very pleasant time. However, too little, while you don't have as much weight to carry, you're going to run out of food and not have the energy, which could lead to falling out with your expedition partner, which really isn't it's the last thing that you really want. On an expedition of this nature, we're unable to refrigerate any food, so everything we bring with it has to be kind of self-preserving, and essentially you don't want it to go off. The food we brought, we needed it to be high calorie but lightweight and low in volume to enable it to fit in our packs and not weigh us down too much. For our main meal of the day being dinner, we settled upon these expedition packs. So on the left, we've got the expedition foods, which were a dehydrated meal, which were really excellent in that they were lightweight because you then add the water when you came to eat them, and they were high in calorie at 1,000 calories per one. However, the trouble with these, they were really expensive at £10 per meal. But then on the right, you see the silver packs, which were a pre-hydrated and lower calorie meal, so we brought a range of them with us. However, our preference over the course of the expedition was certainly towards the orange dehydrated meal, as they taste better and give you far more energy, and also it's lightweight, so the cost is somewhat overcome by the benefits. And here's a lovely picture of the food on top of the mountain. Also on the trip, we brought with us a trail mix that we composed during the kind of the weeks before we were leaving. My approach to that was calculate the calories that we'd need each day for the walking, and then anything not made up by breakfast, lunch and dinner would be substituted with a certain quantity of nuts to make up the calorie count. It's kind of a brute force approach that on paper works. However, in practice, I should have gone for James's approach, which was to make the food much more appealing. So you actually, when really tired and the last thing you wanted is to force down something that you don't really want to eat. So he substituted some nuts with crispy M&Ms, banana chips and dried mango, all mixed in together. So it's much more appealing. So that's a lesson learned for next time.
Yeah, so that was pretty much the end of our planning phase, and sort of we thought, great, we're all set to go. And then of course there was a small hitch when it came to traveling, as obviously this was last summer, that namely being the coronavirus pandemic. So initially we were thinking we're going to have to postpone or even cancel the expedition because Norway had closed its borders to all non-citizens. However, 2 weeks before we were scheduled to leave, we had some really great news, and they'd actually opened up their borders, which was brilliant. And then as if by sort of sheer coincidence, straight after that, Scandinavian Airlines gave us a call and said, we've cancelled your flights. You can't get to Tromsø, which is the city up in the Arctic, which we needed to get to. So we spent several hours, very painful hours, on hold with Scandinavian Airlines, and slowly managed to negotiate a new flight, set of flights, in fact, which was almost comical. We had to fly from London to Copenhagen, wait several hours there, change from a flight at Copenhagen to Oslo, the capital city of Norway, wait another several hours there, and then we flew on a domestic flight all the way up into the Arctic Circle, to the city of Tromsø, where we stayed one night before we set off on our expedition. You can see here on the right the Arctic Cathedral, and it's the largest population centre anywhere near the island of Senya, and so the last stronghold before we set off onto our expedition.
So despite what I said earlier about our trouble with the bus timetable, the bus system we encountered in Norway is actually far better than anything I've ever come across, especially considering how remote the locations we were in. So it was actually the great public transport infrastructure that enabled us to reach Senja in the end. Leaving Tromsø, we took a bus to Brensholmen, which was about an hour's journey with a really nice coastal route illustrated in the previous image. But here, it took us through, just after leaving Tromsø, there was a really cool series of underground tunnels and roundabouts that we then encountered before reaching the ferry, which was our last stop before making it to Senya. Upon arriving at Senya, we had quite a gentle welcome, able to take a not too arduous track to the other side of the island, even getting to stop at a picnic bench for lunch with the locals kindly left us a Norwegian flag just to remind us that we weren't at home anymore. However, it was upon reaching the other side of the island that things got slightly more interesting. So it was at this cove that we realized we weren't able to make it across the other side of the bay, where we had initially had Camp 1 marked on the map. So we were at the red dot in this cove, and we needed to get to the green dot, which was Camp 1. However, what we thought was possible from looking at maps really wasn't when we were actually on the ground. This was the first time that we actually had to really think on our feet, and with everything that we planned completely thrown out the window, using the limited set of information we had, we decided to backtrack to a trail that we'd found earlier, which we hoped would lead us up to a nearby peak.
Yeah, so you can see on our route marking here that we doubled back from the cove and headed up onto this ridge line here, which is a somewhat dubious track, if at all. And when we reached about here, we had a decision to make. Did we now use this height because we thought we could cut down into that cove and get to campsite 1 and carry on with our expedition? Or we were thinking on our feet at this point, should we stay up on this ridge? We've gained almost 100 meters of elevation, so that in the next morning we can cut across, we can contour across the top of the cove and meet our target over on the mountain pass up here without having to lose the elevation. So we thought, yes, we'll do that. And so we continued up along the ridge, which looked like this, to find a campsite. And things were starting to look quite bad as the sun was setting. It never actually fully sets because in the Arctic Circle you have the midnight sun, which is 24 hours a day sunlight. But it did mean that we were getting progressively more tired, and it was the very first day of the expedition, so we didn't want to set too much back on that. So we were about to cut our losses and turn down into the cove and find a place to camp because we just couldn't find any source of water up on this ridgeline. However, I went to relieve myself, and by pure coincidence, behind the rock that I went around, there was a brilliant, well, slightly less than brilliant puddle of water, which was very murky, but we had our water purification and our filters, so we set up camp there just below the snow line, which was still, even though we had 20-degree plus days, was still solid in some places. And you can see in the center of this photo, we pitched our tent and set up camp for the night.
Yeah, Camp 1 really set the bar high for the rest of the trip, as we were met with one of the most spectacular sunsets we really could have ever hoped for. And in my mind, I've got the archetype of an explorer set as someone who goes to bed early and rises early in order to kind of continue with the expedition. But for us at this point, it was really just about taking it all in. So we sat for hours and on the rocks by our tent and just watched the sun sink towards the ocean with seemingly nothing between us but water and the edge of the world. And this is not something that you get to experience very often, especially kind of living in the center of the United Kingdom, not by the sea. And partnered with the 24-hour sunlight, this was really one of the most memorable points of the expedition for us.
So from that point, after spending many hours watching that sun dip almost below the horizon, but never quite reaching it, we packed in for the night. And then the next morning, woke up and got camp packed down. And then we set off. You can see Bert here perched on the rocks. And we then were going to execute our plan that we'd come up with the night before. We were planning to hang around, contour across the top of the cove here, keeping up a nice high elevation so we didn't have to go up and down, which would take almost half a day of hiking, and that would save us a lot of time and effort. However, as you can probably tell by the trend of this talk at the moment, that wasn't the case. That's not what happened. About half an hour into the route across the top of this, the mountain to our left, Skiing Column, got progressively steeper, which wasn't really reflected that accurately on the topographic maps. And we spotted up a ravine ahead. And at that point, we were weighing up the risks throughout the whole expedition just to make sure we were not doing anything stupid. Because both of us have done plenty of training and stuff like mountain exercises and stuff like that. So we knew we didn't want to overstep our risk threshold. So we decided at this point we'd take our backup option and we would go down into the cove across and then back up. And we'd seen one shack in the bottom of the cove and they'd had a quad bike. So we deduced in what turned out to be somewhat flawed logic that they would have a track to easily access that road up in the mountainside that we could just follow up and not spend too much time. However, it may have turned out that this option was potentially A, not the safest route, and B, there may have been some other hitches along the way.
So our attempt to avoid the ridge and find a safer route, as James says, didn't turn out quite how we'd expected, because as we progressed down closer to the coast, the terrain we encountered was a series of medium-sized boulders covered with a mixture of ferns and moss, essentially covering up all of the gaps between the rocks and also making the terrain really quite slippy. This we dubbed ankle breaking terrain, as you really didn't know whether your ankle was going to slip into a gap and just get trapped there. And especially with our 20 kilo plus packs on, there would really be nothing we could do if something like that happened. So thankfully, despite us both having our fair share of trips and slips, nothing worse than that happened. And despite it being really slow progress, we made it further down towards the tree line, which, although the terrain was no better, it did give us something to hold on to, which was at least something.
There's a sort of common exploration sort of adage that lots of people who go on adventures use, and it's the 3 types of fun: type 1, type 2, and type 3. Type 1 is it's an activity that's fun when you're doing it and it's fun afterwards, and everyone I know seems to enjoy that type of fun. Then there's type 2 fun, which isn't really that fun when you're doing it, but afterwards you think, yeah, actually that was pretty fun. And then type 3 fun, which isn't fun when you're doing it, and it is definitely not fun after you've done it. And I know Bert and I, we like to push that upper limit of type 2 fun, and the closer you can get to type 3 without overstepping it, the better. So this was definitely filed in the type 2 fun category. And another sort of exploration adage is the adventure only starts when things start to go wrong. And almost strangely, this happened straight away. As we were descending the mountainside, we came across approximately marked in this orange location here, what we initially thought to be some kind of collapsed pylon or wreckage. But actually, when we got closer, we realized it was a plane crash. You can see on the photo on the left there, the wing and that central spar, which has proved quite important in our research later on. And then an image of me looking into a bulkhead on the right. And again, that wooden propeller on the bottom left and this central spar. And we assumed at the time that this would be a well-documented crash site. We didn't have phone signal, as much of the island wasn't covered by that, but we said, we'll take our photos, take a few notes on it. And when we're somewhere with signal after the expedition, we will do some research into it and find out what's going on. It did turn out afterwards, there's actually no record of this crash as far as we found so far. There are other crashes recorded in the region, but none of them come within hundreds of kilometers of this one. What our research has led us to so far is just a shot of one of the interior pits of the wreckage. So you can see it's in quite reasonably good condition in some areas, but we estimate it's around a World War II bit of wreckage. And the closest we've come to identifying what kind of plane this could be is a Blom and Voss plane, which is used by the Luftwaffe in World War II, a reconnaissance and seaplane. However, the wreckage we came across wasn't this specific aircraft. But the only reason we've been able to draw on that is that central spar, which is highlighted by the red there, which you could have seen in the wreckage, is the very rarely found on planes. And this is the only type we found so far. So currently we're in partnership with the Visit Senya Region Tourist Board, working to further research this crash. And hopefully before too long, we'll be able to find out what the story of this crash is. But from the crash site, we continued on down the slope until we met the cove. And at that point, we were going to ask the people in the shack, well, whereabouts is your trail to get up to that mountain road? So we set off along the beach, and outside the shack, there are 3 Norwegians sat on a balcony looking at us quite quizzically as we approached, and we introduced ourselves as politely as possible. And it was clear they weren't used to having very many people walking through this cove, as it was highly inaccessible, it turned out to be. And we said, how do we get up to the mountain road? And we'd sort of had in the back of our minds, worst case scenario, we'll follow those power lines up. And they just said power lines. And that was pretty much the end of the conversation, because there was no access to the cove except for by a boat, which we learned at that point. So this is when we really entered our power lines phase, which wasn't as what we thought it would be.
Indeed. It was much to our dismay when we were met with the advice to simply follow the power lines, which really isn't a path at all, as it really, when we were there, it looked like maybe one person had walked up there once recently. And by recently, I mean, there was a couple of footprints, but really nothing you could string together. And it really wasn't a very well walked path of the island, and for good reason, because with no ability to contour, you literally have to just walk straight up the mountain. And as you can see, with the completely clear skies, well, we take the clear skies over a week of rain any day. It did mean that because of the hours we lost in the morning due to having to go down and then back up because the contouring didn't work, we were taking this ascent in the middle of the day, so that we also had the heat to contend with. This image shows the last 60 to 80 meters of the climb, which turned into a near vertical kind of rock fall type thing. But in a paradoxical way, it was almost nice to climb this, as we had to climb it on all fours, but because of the surer footing, and it forced us to slow down. So it was almost a bit of respite from the much more punishing but less steep parts of the climb earlier on. But breaching the ridge here, we made it to a mountain lake, which essentially signaled the end of the climb and an opportunity for us to take a break.
And almost interestingly, a side effect of being forced onto all fours is you really notice the microscopic details around you in the landscape. These are some of the sort of tiny flora from the island, and obviously a lot of this has to be very small in order to survive the very extreme Arctic winters. They get meters of snow on the island and everything's cut off, but during the summer it all completely comes to life, and it's almost more than what we were expecting for it to be. We were expecting a barren coastal island, but it's absolutely packed with life. And actually, when we were coming down by this mountain lake, which we finally reached after that brutal ascent, we noticed in a sort of boggy area sundew plants, which are carnivorous plants with sort of sticky tendrils that trap flies and digest them because they're growing in areas of nutrient deficit. So that was quite a cool observation, we thought, to find on our way. But we'd reached the road, and you can see here we're very pleased to be free of all that vegetation and the cove. And at this point, we're really in high spirits. And on our initial route plan, we were coming and meeting this road up here by this mountain lake. And the next stage, next phase of the expedition was to, like we planned to initially near Camp 1, go along the edge of the coast and then cut up through some mountains in order to reach the fjord with the town of Fjordgard in, which would signal the area where Mount Segla is. All of these words sound very similar. We're on the island of Senya and we're looking for the island of Mount Segla. Anyway, that was our end goal. And hopefully I won't get those two words mixed up, but that was what we'd really come on the expedition to see. It's seen as the pinnacle of Senya in terms of the landscape, and there's an amazing vista which can be had from the mountain next to it. So that's what we're aiming for. And because of that, we had a few logistical pressures put on us. We had a certain amount of time to reach Senya in order to successfully complete the expedition. If we didn't reach Senya in time, that would mean missing buses to ferry ports on the island, missing boats and missing flights, which wouldn't have been ideal and basically just wasn't possible. So at this stage, at the road here, we had a decision to make. Do we try and continue with our original plan and cut across that large mountain landscape? Or do we adapt? Do we think on our feet? And do we come up with an alternate route? And ultimately, that's what we did. We moved from this mountain lake here. We decided we'd cut down through this valley, hang around on the coast down here, lower down from Bottenham, and head up into the valley towards Fjordgard and our final goal. So we set off, we made really good progress, and we came around the edge of the valley here towards this second blue marker at the lower end of the screen. And it was about evening time at this point. And usually if you're on the coast of the island, you get these magnificent sunsets that we had on night one. But because we were in this large mountain valley, that meant the shadows were getting long and suddenly it became very cold. So we had to look for a place to camp relatively quickly.
In Norway, there's the term allemannsretten, which is essentially the right to roam. And this principle has essentially enabled us to pitch up our tents wherever we wanted, so long as we kind of look after the environment around us and leave it as we found it. And this meant that we didn't have to follow a predetermined set of campsites, and we could kind of adapt to what the situation was on the road. So then we could kind of, we could stage ourselves whenever we wanted. But it also meant that we were much more in and around the nature, and were able to experience very different things. And for Camp 2, we ended up in a forest clearing just by a river, which, while we knew we weren't going to get the spectacular sunsets of Camp 1, the promise of something great on the third night was very much, it enabled us to settle down here. However, while on the first night we did experience quite a lot of mosquitoes, it was the river and the forest that really provided us with unforgiving quantities of them, and it was really something we'd expected, but not of this scale. Over the trip, what made it worse for me was I received about 4 or 5 times more mosquito bites than James. So despite the application of the strongest bug spray that we could both get our hands on, and when I say strong, it's the watch I was wearing on the expedition, the watch face has been cracked by the bug spray, and also with some of the watch strap corroded. So it does make you wonder what it was doing to our skin. But but despite the strength of the stuff, it really wouldn't keep the mosquitoes at bay. So while I was running around kind of slapping myself all over to try and get them away from me and have a minute without something buzzing in my ear, James was peacefully sat by the river enjoying his dinner. And his theory is that because before we left for the expedition, he used a peppermint shampoo, and it was that was repelling the mosquitoes. I personally, I don't know about you, but I think that's a load of rubbish and really wouldn't make much of a difference. But despite that view, I will actually be using peppermint shampoo before my next expedition, just in the hope that it changes something.
So following the essentially attack from the mosquitoes, we retreated into our tent for the night. You can see us here sheltering inside and packed in for the night. And then the next morning, we woke up and we are ready. This is our final day. We needed to really set a good pace up into that fjord so we could get to Mount Segler in time for our final night. We made brilliant progress at first. We raced up that valley towards this point here, the small ridge between us and the fjord. And again, we had another choice to make here. Do we go up and over, which we had a potential possibility to do? There were some routes we could see, but there was a risk, and we'd learned from further earlier on that topographic maps aren't exactly representative, and there was a risk that we wouldn't be able to get ourselves over down the other side due to the steepness of it, as we didn't have the right kit in our packs. So we opted for the slightly less risky decision, but still somewhat dodgy, of going through a very poorly lit 800-meter road tunnel with no pedestrian access. So we strapped a torch, head torch onto the back of my pack, and we made fairly rapid progress through this tunnel into the fjord. And I think it's fair to say we definitely weren't expecting what was on the other side. This is a shot of our map here, and you can see the fjord here with really steep sides, Keipen Mountain and Segler up here, and Heston, our targets. But as Bert said earlier, Norway, Segler is seen as Norway in miniature, and this was really when that came to bear. We'd seen a variety of other Norwegian landscapes earlier on, which were amazing, we loved. But this is sort of the true Norway. The sheer scale of the sides of the fjord were absolutely staggering. And we took that in, had something to eat, and then we set on towards Fjordgard and towards Heston. And to do this, there was an old abandoned road that traversed the edge of the fjord, which we were soon to find out why it was abandoned.
Indeed, we were. The abandoned road, as we have now dubbed it, was really quite convenient, as it enabled us to stay on the outside of and the edge of the fjord, enabling us to kind of still experience the dramatic landscapes and things like that. Whereas the alternative was to another and longer road tunnel. So really, there really was no question about which option we were going to take. But we didn't come to regret it, but perhaps another in another life we may have, because the road initially was littered with a small series of rocks and kind of a little bit of dust, sorry. But it was like, it's kind of, you notice it, but nothing more. However, as we got further and further, kind of the rock falls got more and more, getting to the point where we'd have to kind of go quite far to one side of the road or the other to be able to carry on through. We then reached a point where the most significant rockfall we came across had completely covered the entire road to the extent, as you can see in the picture, well, you couldn't see the road anymore, meaning we had to clamber over it. And with our packs, this was slightly more of a challenge, but we made it through. However, the point that was somewhat more worrying was underneath this rockfall, there was fresh snow. And given the warm temperatures we had been experiencing, we don't think the snow could really have been there for any more than a few hours, meaning that should our day 2 morning have not taken so long, we could have suffered a different fate. However, we didn't, and we're here now. So reaching the end of this abandoned road, we set eyes on Mount Segler for the first time. And with this being the pinnacle of the expedition, something we've been looking forward to the whole time and kept in mind while enduring the physical aspects of the expedition, to be perfectly honest with you, it wasn't as dramatic an entrance as we were expecting, because without the sheer faces and the dramatic backdrop that we had seen online, it was really just a bit of a lump sticking out of the ground, and it wasn't even the biggest lump around. So it was somewhat of a challenge to keep our motivation high at this point, and especially because it was the first time in days that we'd seen any cloud cover, and it was exactly the time that we wanted it the least. But even with this, we ploughed on in the hope that something would change.
So this was the first time we saw it, and like, as Bert said, slightly underwhelming, but we carried on as ever, and our target was that slightly smaller looking mountain on the right hand side, which is Heston. That's 550 meters tall, versus Segler, Mount Segler on the left there, which is 670 or so meters tall. But the reason we wanted to do that is we wanted to get up onto that ridge near to Heston so we could camp and look back at Mount Segler from what we thought to be was the best angle and get the whole vista with the rest of the island. So again, as we noticed on the first day up on that campsite, there was very little water available on these higher areas. So we had to stock up with a huge amount of water in our bottles and packs for the challenging climb and for all of our cooking that night as we're going to be camping up there, which really added that little bit of extra weight, which we didn't need for these final ascents. But we carried on, and this is going up onto the ridge of Heston here. You can see the route we picked out with the yellow line. But towards the top especially, it was a bit of a hazard again because of the dry weather we've been having. That path had just turned to dust and sand, which on the sheer gradient was very slippy and made it a real challenge to get up and over. But we eventually got up on top of it, and as there's a scene in the film which has to be one of my favorites from when we experienced it, where there's a time lapse of all the cloud cover burning off, and out of the mist emerges Mount Segler and this amazing vista behind us. And that was really when we started thinking, yeah, this is what the expedition is all about, and just the wilderness and the sheer scale of it all. So at that point, we set up our camp for the night on this little pitch here. You can see Bert there enjoying our luxury campsite. And we both maintain this to this day, that actually this spot of camping had to be the best place to camp in the world on that night, because perfect conditions, nice and warm, and then the amazing sunset, which we're to experience soon. So we were camped out on the ridge of Heston, about 100 meters below the actual peak. So at about 10 p.m, we set off towards the peak of Heston. You can see here looking back at Mount Segler and the scramble up to the top. And we reached the peak maybe about 10:30, just in time to get golden hour, which in the case of Segler isn't an hour, but several hours due to the midnight sun. And that was just amazing. The whole landscape just drenched in this orange, and it was really an amazing moment, sort of signifying the end goal of our expedition. And also, again, the geography coming to play here. This is a shot from the peak of Heston, taken a few meters from the edge, which was definitely as close as I was going to get, because on the other side of it is this 550-meter vertical cliff face straight down to the sea below. Not something that you want to go near. And on these pictures, which we're about to show you, we're just the size of pinpricks. We put the drone up and got some amazing shots, which really just signified the sheer scale of the landscape that we're in. And with the golden sunset and everything around us, it was just absolutely an amazing place to be in for those few hours. You can see here looking back onto the island and all the other peaks and almost where we'd come from, which was a really amazing experience. We then headed back down off the peak, settled into our camp for the night, and just did got our meals sorted, and then we did one final hike up to the other edge of Heston, and we got this shot of Bert and I sat, which is turned out to be the cover of our film. And at this point, it was really the culmination of the expedition. We'd covered 90 kilometers with almost 50 kilos of equipment, 5,000 feet in elevation change. It was really something we were both very proud of. And it's thanks to the Richard Greene Memorial Award and the OMT Society and Merchant Taylors, we were able to make this a reality, something which I'm not sure we would have foreseen at the start of our upper sixth, let alone any other time. And we just wanted to say thank you to everyone involved getting it into a reality. And it's really inspired us. It's given us an opportunity to really experience a real expedition all the way through the entire process. And we've already got plans for expeditions potentially in the future to Patagonia with larger teams and more adventurous goals. But thank you very much for listening. And I'm going to hand over to Sachin now, who's going to field some questions, I think.
First of all, James, I just want to thank you and Bert for delivering a thoroughly engaging talk about your adventures. I'm now going to field some questions that have been steadily coming in. So first of all, guys, I want to ask, how did you charge your devices and drone while you were out there?
That's a really interesting one. Again, this is something we had to think about in the planning phase. And Bert and I both acquired a power pack each before the trip, because we looked into solar charging, but with those variable conditions, it wasn't something we wanted to risk. And also that meant we had to be very careful with the use of devices. So we turned them off when we weren't using them. The drone, we're very lucky to be able to use it, but we did have limited times when we could fly it. So we saved that for the very end, which we had our fingers crossed we get the good weather, and for a patch of time at the start where we needed to use it to search out. But we just used power packs and basically didn't use devices unless it was absolutely necessary.
I think the next one is, can you tell us something about the rock formations, as the scenery looked stunning?
James.
As the resident geographer, I'll field that question. Senya is primarily a granite, well, pretty much 99% granite in terms of rock. And then there's basically a layer of soils and peat on top of that, which the plants grow in. But at some points on tracks and trails, you can actually see this layer of granite, and just perched on top and basically slipping off in places was this granite. And the sheer formations are essentially just enormous slabs of granite.
Go ahead to Mrs. Hale, who I think has a question.
Hello, nice to see you both. Sorry that I don't have my video on. I'm just in the middle of my supper. But thanks very much for your presentation. It was so great to hear what you've been up to. My question is, how were you able to sleep in the midnight sun?
Well, obviously being in a tent there doesn't block out a lot of the light, but I just slid my beanie down over my face and had that covering it. And well, with the exercising all day, sleep comes quite easily. So it wasn't actually any much of a hindrance.
I think it would have been quite entertaining to look at us in that tent, because Bert had his beanie over his head. I threw a jacket over my head, and basically you just pass out wherever you are because you've been going for so long. So luckily that wasn't too much of a problem.
Great, thanks very much.
Next we'll go to Hamish Stewart, who I think has a question.
Look, thanks to both of you. That was a really fascinating presentation. But I was just curious about the plane crash. How is that investigation going? And I know this sounds kind of rather morbid, but were there any human remains on the site?
Yeah, so thanks. Really good question. We were slightly concerned. At least I was. Maybe Bert kept his cool. But when we initially realised it was a plane crash, that was the thought in my mind: is should we be filming this? Because if there are human remains and stuff like that, is that a sensitive thing to do? Thankfully, there weren't, and I think it was, from what we've identified it with the propellers and the state of sort of decay of the stuff. It's probably about World War II era, so there wasn't anything left. In terms of the plane, there are very few markings left in it. The aluminium was sort of preserved eerily well, but we got a few serial numbers, a few flecks of paint here and there. And in terms of the spread of the crash, it was spread about 200 to 300 meters along the top of the cove. So it has similar sort of crash style to a lot of planes in the region, where during the winter period especially, they'll be flying up these fjords during winter cloudy conditions, and they'll just miscalculate the height or the length of the fjord and end up hitting the end of it. And that's what the distribution of the crash remains show. But obviously we didn't know that it was an unrecorded crash at the time. So we have the location of it and we have the few photos and things that we got. But if we'd known it wasn't recorded, we might have been maybe more alert to that at the time and talked to the people down in the cove about it. And in terms of the investigation, we are facing a lot of challenges in communicating with some of the Norwegian authorities, but we did manage to open up a dialogue with the Senya region tourist board. And literally as we speak, they're over the last few days, they've kickstarted talking to people in the region to try and find out if this is in fact a fully unrecorded plane crash, which we think is quite unlikely, or if it's just something that the locals know about that hasn't been widely publicized, whether that's because they don't want people trekking into the cove to see it or for other reasons. But as of now, I'm afraid the match to the Blom and Voss Luftwaffe aircraft is about as close as we've got, but we can't say it's that aircraft because the crash is just not the same. But we're going to be publishing anything that we do find, and we'll be sure to pass that on to the school so they can circulate it.
Next, we've got a question from Miss Innes.
Hi guys, thanks so much for that. It was really great to hear. I'm curious how your time at MTS helped to prepare you for this expedition, if at all.
I personally feel it was more the out of the classroom pursuits. So it was the Duke of Edinburgh that, for me, I didn't do CCF, so it was the Duke of Edinburgh practice that kind of gave me insights into what we would need to do with the planning phase. So with the expedition meals, I'd only come across them from another group member in DFE. So without that, the expedition could have looked really quite different because of how much we probably have to carry much more in terms of weight in our packs. So it was definitely the extracurricular that MT's put on. It provided kind of insights into the sort of environment that enabled us to build on it. And James, you probably got some things to say about CCF, I suppose.
I'm not predictable at all, but yeah, definitely for me, CCF was a major one. I mean, just a year before, myself and another upper sixth boy, Pandius, had gone on a fully sponsored mountain training course for a week up in the Lake District, and stuff like that, adventurous training, all the extracurricular stuff really helped out, because that was sort of the practical know-how of how to confidently go into somewhere that's very remote and at points actually quite dangerous. So without relevant first aid training, which we'd also done at school, and stuff like that, it may be more irresponsible. But we felt that with all the training that the school had actually really impressively provided us in a roundabout way, we were pretty confident doing that. And then also just general awareness of the Arctic region, especially sort of geography, the number one subject, of course, but that was something that I'd sort of come onto my radar, things about global warming, but sort of untouched wilderness. When we were looking at the start for where do you go to find somewhere that there's no humans, the poles is probably a pretty good idea to start with. Obviously we couldn't get into the poles, but places within the Arctic Circle and stuff like that is probably what flagged us. Yeah.
Thanks for the question, guys. Make sure you keep them coming in. I think next, Lucy Broad had a question.
Did you see any animals, and what kind of animals did you see?
So I spotted, strangely on the island, we saw droppings from animals, and we found a strange number of frogs, or at least we heard them, especially on the first night, all over the island. Never saw them. I spent a good hour and a half, I think, during that sunset, walking around trying to find a frog to take a photo of, because they were all around us, but I think they were just mocking me. But then on the transit to and from Senya, we both spotted a reindeer out of the bus. So that was sort of the biggest creature that we saw in the region. And we didn't spot any, but the fjords are really important breeding grounds for whales. So in some of the images in the film, you can see actually they have fish farms because the sheer amount of nutrients and that sort of easy access from the coastal towns. But that would be what we could have spotted. But yeah, a reindeer is the biggest animal we spotted.
Yeah, I'd been really hopeful for trying to find some whales while we were on the expedition, but sadly that never materialized. But James forgot to mention the mosquitoes. They are, after all, an animal, despite their best efforts to portray themselves as something else.
Next, Mr. Murray, I think you had a question, sir. Well, if he doesn't want to ask it, I'll ask it. What made you boys settle in Senya for the trip?
So we knew we wanted to do something in Norway because that was where we could maximize the fun that we got from the prize. And initially, I mean, Bert outlined at the start of the talk briefly. So we had our sights set all over Norway, traveling between loads of different areas, trying to get in all the big things. Then we realized that wasn't really A, achievable, B, it was very lucky because coronavirus would have probably stopped us from doing most of that, but also that wasn't really true wilderness. And the further up in Norway you go, it seems to be the more wild you get. So Bert discovered Senja during our research, and basically from the point he said, look at this island, we are both pretty set on that as a location.
I've got one for you as well. How do you think the pandemic kind of shifted your plans? I know you kind of mentioned there was you were in a bit of limbo for a few weeks with the flights, but how did they impact your plans overall?
I think the pandemic's impact was mainly in the kind of the difficulty in reaching there. It also affected the dates of travel, but with the pandemic, essentially all other plans were out of the window. So we could literally we could put the trip wherever we wanted. And thankfully the flights came up. It was 3 flights in the end rather than 1. But in terms of the actual expedition itself, thankfully all the systems within Norway were running completely as normal, as their management of the pandemic was pretty handy when compared to perhaps what we'd been suffering in the United Kingdom. And the expedition, because it's once we were there, it relied so little on actual infrastructure and more just on our own 2 feet, that remained largely unchanged.
Yeah, the only major, almost what could have been major hiccup for us would actually be after the expedition, when we exfilled from the island, we returned to Tromsø for a couple of days just to recover before our flight out. And the day we arrived in Tromsø, I remember I got a text from my parents saying, "It's Tromsø you're in, right?" Yeah. Well, there's a cruise ship that's pulled in, and yesterday they let every single person off in and around Tromsø, and I think 90% of them had coronavirus. So that was a slight hazard, but thankfully we were following all the procedures, so we didn't contract coronavirus. But that was maybe the only potential one hiccup.
Yeah, that could have ended the trip early.
Got another great question here. You are clearly good friends who trust each other implicitly. Did you surprise each other in any way? And what traits in each other did you each find the most important?
Oh.
Do you want to start, or shall I go first, Bert?
If you've got something, please.
Whoa. I think trust is really important. And Bert and I have been friends since, well, when I started Merchant Tailors in year 9, and that was important, I think, for sure. But also this was almost something more than that, because when you're going across pretty hazardous terrain, you need to be able to rely on the person who's with you, both day to day, and also really if something goes wrong, that they'll know what to do and they'll react in a predictable way to ensure everything stays safe. But also there's that extreme end which really relies on that trust, which I think we both had. But also just when you're on an expedition like this, you are your own company for days on end. We for the first several days of the expedition, we didn't see anyone at all. So it was just us and the wilderness, and you're sleeping in what is realistically a very small tent, and you're doing everything together. So there's that level of trust, but a friendship that really builds. And I think it's something that could potentially break up a friendship, but I think it only strengthened it because we got future ideas already. But yeah,
I definitely second the trust thing, but it's also it's the confidence you have in one another and how comfortable you feel around them. Because on an expedition of this nature, where you're essentially pushing your body as hard as you can, and with that comes some very low moods potentially, and just having being comfortable enough around each other to show that and not try and hide that. Because if you're battling your emotions to try and cover it up, that adds another layer of struggle to an expedition that you really don't want to add. So it's the having spent so much time around each other before, it enables us to be on the expedition to just be completely comfortable around each other and be honest. So because with some expeditions, perhaps people haven't spent so much time with their expedition partners, so things come up that you haven't expected, and then that's how expeditions fall apart. But for us, nothing, I wouldn't say, was completely unexpected from one another, and that enabled us just to focus on kind of getting over the mountains rather than fighting each other.
Yeah, thanks to Joe and Smart for that question. I think Mr. Latham had a question as well.
Yeah, thanks, guys. I had a question. I think you said how much distance you covered overall. I just wanted to know a bit more about what distance you covered each day. And the geeky cyclist in me was interested to know how many calories you reckoned you burned each day, and whether you had the right amount and right type of food with hindsight, or whether you have changed that at all.
That's an interesting question. Just touching on that food one straight away, Bert talked about it at the start, but the difference in the dehydrated and the rehydrated food. And thankfully, we were able to get that most of our food from, thankfully, CCF were very kindly able to give it to us, which cut down on the cost of it, because obviously the dehydrated food is very expensive. But really, with the power of hindsight, as you said, we definitely opt for purely dehydrated food, because the amount of weight that you're carrying when you're carrying water in your food is just absolutely ridiculous. And that additional weight, I mean, it obviously it got better as the expedition went on, as you're eating the food, but it just meant at the start, unloading from that boat and sending off was almost ridiculous with the sheer amount of weight. So a lot of energy expended. I'll leave Bert to go the specifics of the calories, I think, because he has a bit more idea than me. But distance on a day-to-day basis really varied massively, because some days we were able to just power off down these easy valleys and make really rapid progress, and then other days, just like on the first day, it was very, very slow progress, doubling back and forwards and just really taking our time and being careful. So that really varied, but it was 90 or so kilometers overall. And then the elevation change as well was something almost that we didn't anticipate, because we knew there are mountains that we're going over, but actually you'd expect a mountain, an island, which is right on the coast, to probably have relatively low levels of things. But due to the extreme geography, even if you're going up and down valleys, the hundreds of meters of elevation change, even if you're just walking on the flat.
So yeah, the calories. I can't remember the exact calculations I did before leaving, but I think I may have decided that we needed about 4,000 calories a day. We didn't bring a calorie tracker with us or anything like a smartwatch or anything like that. So we don't have actual numbers for how much we burned in the end. But with hindsight, we definitely had food left over. So it was an overestimation. And then things like I bought oat cakes and like great slow burning calories, but the appeal really wasn't there to eat them when the time came. So they tended to come home with us. So with hindsight, more Mars bars, things like that, and perhaps a lower calorie count as well.
Thanks.
I think Mr. Richard Bruman had a question as well.
Guys, thanks so much for an absolutely wonderful talk. Do you like sitting on a beach, or is it just trekking for you?
Oh, I love sitting on the beach. It's a bit of both. It's I suppose sitting on the beach is you get to sit down and reflect, but with nothing to reflect on, it loses its value. So doing something like this expedition enables you to then, while it's the sort of more the type 2 fun that James mentioned, where it's not fun in the moment, but it's fun afterwards. Sitting on the beach would give you the time to enjoy the sort of the enjoyment afterwards and reflect on it.
Yeah, there's definitely a time and a place for relaxing. But I do find myself when I'm in those situations, in the back of my mind, I'm always thinking, oh, so what are we going to do now? What are we going to do? I can never really be 100% relaxed on a beach or something like that. But it's definitely important, as Bert said, just to have that time for reflection and relaxation, and also just having fun in the moment, because sometimes when you're on an expedition, you're really pushing yourself and it can be really grueling. And that's something that I know I seek and Bert definitely seeks as well. But it's about having that balance for sure. But I think in the back of my mind, it's always what's next.
Thank you.
Got another question about your future from the host, Ms. Binlos.
Hello, I just want to say thank you so much. I'm not on mute, no. It's been fascinating. I particularly wanted to ask whether you've started your planning for your trip to Patagonia and how long you think that planning would take.
Yeah, so it's in a very early stages at the moment. We're really thinking about the type of expedition that we want to do, because we're really fortunate in how the sort of Seeking Wild expedition went in. We were in that proper wilderness and we had that target, and it's quite important with an expedition to have an aim, I think. Otherwise it's not really an expedition or an adventure, and part of that is putting yourself in somewhere that's quite extreme. So we were looking through shortlisting places. We're sort of back at that stage we had initially with the Greene Memorial Prize, looking all over the world. Things like Greenland came up, but the challenges which arise with places like that, which we will, I'm sure, someday get to, but the sheer cost of expedition travel is just absolutely ridiculous, especially in Greenland, for example, where there's that very low population density, which is great for expeditions. But that means if you want to take a flight to somewhere, you're chartering that flight. And if you want to get onto that ice sheet, because of the low population density, it doesn't make sense for them to have a search and rescue function like, for example, Norway does, which is what made our expedition really possible there. In Greenland, you have to pay huge amounts of money for search and rescue cover and things like that. So Patagonia was a place, sort of a preliminary place for us that thought it's got that wilderness, but it does have that access at this stage. And we're also thinking about, well, we've done it together before. What happens if we bring on some other people to the group to make this a slightly bigger affair? Because we both have friends who are and sort of people who we've done similar stuff with before, who we think would complement a team and would really help turn the expedition into something bigger. And obviously we produced a film this time, and that's something that we're both pretty keen on, because it gives a great way for people who weren't able to be there to experience some of the aspects and stuff like that. But it's very early stages at the moment. And it won't be this summer for sure, because access, especially with vaccination passports and stuff, just might not be possible. But it's something that the planning, I'm sure, will take longer for more people and the further away you go. But
to add to what James was saying, finding places for expeditions, because as we alluded to at the beginning, it's all about finding the wilderness, and it's the very nature of the Richard Greene Memorial Prize. But with the world being so populated these days, there's the space between a really high-end expedition such as the Greenland that James mentioned, where it's not only the financial cost, but also the skills you need and the kit you need. So it's if you're going to the Arctic, say, the quality of wear that you need to prevent and keep you safe is so much higher. So it's finding the fine line between just following a path for a week over a mountain range, say, and then the really fully fledged, there's absolutely no one anywhere in sight. It's because what we're aiming for is the middle ground, and it's trying to find that's kind of the challenge.
Brilliant. I'm sure you'll do it.
So I think that kind of wraps up the questions from everyone. So I just wanted to finally say thank you on on everyone's behalf, a brilliant and thoroughly engaging talk from both James and Bert. I mean, what stood out for me was the amount of planning and ability to think quickly on your feet that kind of shone throughout your presentation, and it really showed that you went to one of the most beautiful places in the world, and I'm sure all of us were looking enviously on from that sunset we saw on Camp 1. So I just wanted to thank you guys for delivering a great talk.
Thank you very much, Sachin.
Thank you.